Gervais. In this video I'm going to be talking about both of Clive Barker's games, Undying and Jericho. Undying is regarded as kind of an underappreciated classic, but Jericho is a notorious flop. Both of them have Clive Barker's stamp all over them. We're going to be talking about why and how they work both as games and Clive Barker's own private creative work. Let's get started. There was a time in the 80s when it looked like Clive Barker was going to become the #1 name in horror media, where his particular vision of the weird and fantastic was going to surpass even Stephen King's in recognizability. At the time, he was certainly one of the most bold and creative voices in the genre. Barker did a lot to take body horror and horrific sensuality mainstream. King's kind of horror is usually small-town characters using hidden depths to defeat strange evils and their personal failings, but Barker's work is more about those personal failings manifesting as the horrific creatures and powers themselves, selfish and hedonistic impulses taken farther than comfort or safety or sanity ought to allow. Many horror authors, directors, and game makers conceive of scaring the audience as the goal. Make them yelp, get their hearts racing. You stamp something Clive Barker's so-and-so, though, and the implication isn't that you'll get so straightforward a horror experience. Ideally, if a piece of media is true to Barker's aesthetic, its main goal is provoking deep discomfort and a kind of sympathetic revulsion. Hellraiser, Barker's most famous movie and visible creation, has monsters who all used to be human. They used to be terrible humans, which makes them excellent monsters. The puzzle box in that movie is a good example of a classic Barker trope. A hidden universe, secret but in plain sight, wherein extreme and endless sensation, infinite pain and infinite pleasure transforms its visitors permanently into chimeras of their foulest desires. They are trapped forever in hells within and without, deformed hells of the body, twisted hells of the mind. So, visually, you've got this aesthetic of otherworldly realms populated by angry, fleshy, demonic forms, and tonally, you've got this aesthetic of decadent madness, something more fundamentally sexual and psychological than authors like King or Kuntz, something more deranged and chaotic than Anne Rice, something as fantastic and surreal as Lovecraft without the infuriating vagueness. He was a really transformative voice in horror for a lot of years, and then he kinda drifted away. Barker's been continuing to do interesting work this whole time, but his star has waned, and his recognizability as a big-name horror guy is at a bit of a low. During the early and mid-2000s, Barker put in work on 2 video games bearing his name, 2001 survival horror FPS Undying, and 2007 squad shooter Jericho. The former is regarded as a great, albeit mostly forgotten game, and the second is a notorious flop, the Edsel of horror shooters. In terms of design, they're pretty much opposite games, yet Clive Barker worked on each, gave his creative stamp to both, and believed in their worth as art and horror media. Even Jericho. Barker's many successes in print and film are well known. His bold and strange stabs into the medium of video games are a lot less talked about, even less often talked about in context with the author's other works. What I want to know is straightforward, but the answer is complicated. Is there anything truly and uniquely Clive-Barkery about the Clive Barker games?
It seems fair to say that Clive Barker saved Undying. The game had been under production for a while before he was asked to come in and provide new direction by the publisher. What they handed him was something extremely traditional, a Gothic manor with a family curse, which is the oldest book in the tricks as far as horror goes. The specific setup, the Gothic romance, goes back to 1764 and Horace Walpole's novel The Castle of Otranto. A Gothic novel takes place in a dilapidated but palatial setting, usually a manor or a castle. It focuses on the ghosts of the past, both literal and psychological. Its primary theme, across novel after novel during the 18th and 19th century, is that the sins of the father will consume the sons. Depending on the author, this would be paired with a lot of really bizarre sexual horror, like in 1796's The Monk. That's the thing. As incredibly dated, cliché, and well-worn as the Gothic novel and Gothic tropes are, they are transgressive enough to resonate with Barker's own modern aesthetic, as foul and transfixing in Barker's original work as they are in much dustier tomes. The clichés that Barker wanted to avoid in the script weren't the ones that were 200 years old. He'd play around with those. What he removed from the script is the kind of over-the-top late 90s action game nonsense that was so pervasive in that era of FPS titles. Undying's original protagonist was a major product of his time, and as such was the first on the chopping block. Here's Barker from a 2001 interview about the game. Quote, "We had a really charmless hero. We had this fellow called Magnus, Count Magnus Wolfram, who was bald, tattooed, looked like a comic book hero, and I got them all in a room, and I said, look, does anybody in this room know a Count? No. Does anybody in this room know anybody called Magnus? No. Does anybody really want to be in this guy's skin? Since this is first-person play, why would you want to be in this man's skin? Why would you play as him? And so we threw him out, and I said, look, you've got a gay man in charge here. Bring me somebody I want to sleep with. Bring me somebody fabulously sexy. And because my training is in art, I drew some sketches. They were mainly of what I wanted his face to be. And this brilliant artist, Brian Horton, about 10 days later, sent me the character that now appears on screen." End quote. The many cliches of Gothic horror are malleable. They can be made unsettling and impactful with artistically genuine perspective behind them. But the many cliches of first-person shooter writing circa 2001? All that shit's gotta go. So with Patrick Galloway on the drawing board and Magnus Wolfram in the wastebasket, Barker's reimagining of the game began.
I found a scroll with I joined a special unit.
Barker would go on to say in the interview that he felt like he had a hand in shaping all the characters, and it does feel like it. Even voices Ambrose, the eldest brother, in the second boss fight of the game. I have no idea what Magnus Wolfram's connection to the story might have been, but Patrick Galloway starts off many years before the game even opens. During World War I, he served with a guy named Jeremiah Covenant, a bookish officer who helped him through the war. During the conflict, they encounter an occult group whose leader carries the Gelzabar Stone, a funny little magic trinket. Galloway takes it with him, and having started down the path of paranormal detective, he continued that direction after the war. He can't return to Ireland. He was framed for the murder of his wife by another occultist named Kessinger, but Jeremiah sends him a letter asking him to come right away, and Galloway is not one to let down a friend. So, the game opens. Galloway walking up to the gates of the mysterious and foreboding Covenant estate. This is about as classic as you get for the Gothic setup. I wonder if the reason Barker went in such a traditional direction with horror has to do with the newness of the medium. Barker, in his own written work, has an extremely contemporary aesthetic. He's unpredictable in setting, characters, and execution. In one short story, a quarreling gay couple's vacation is interrupted by two towns that form themselves into giants, linking together like ants in a flood, and then battling, like they have for hundreds of years. In another, a scientist working on an aphrodisiac gets it much too right and spirals down into monstrous evil hedonism. And in another, the demons who run New York City send their butcher out into the subways to bring them sacrifices. What I love about Barker's work is his unpredictability. With Stephen King, it's 50-50. You're going to get small-town characters talking about small-town concerns before something terrible kills them all. With Anne Rice, you're almost certainly going to have beautiful monsters complaining at length to one another about one another. It's out of character for Barker to do something so explicitly stuck in the tropes of the genre, especially the constricting subgenre of Gothic horror is Undying. But this was his first stab at creating horror for an interactive medium, and he took the challenge seriously. Long before it was fashionable, Barker has been saying that video games are in fact art, and he's involved himself in them from that perspective. So when he first branched out, he began at the beginning, adapting the oldest form of popular horror for a medium that's barely existed for more than 50 years, one that can present these old stories in really genuinely new and novel ways. There are many touches in the dialogue, motivations, and art that feel very rooted in Barker's personal tropes, but the overall experience is as traditional as you get, right down to the whole setup. The sins of the fathers consume the offspring. Jeremiah's father was a magician of note, and had many spell books. Jeremiah gathered his siblings when they were all children, reading from a borrowed tome. They accidentally awoke something horrible, of course, a poison that's been seeping into the ground for centuries, and one by one, over the years, the curse they wrought on themselves that day destroyed them, and after they died, they came back, waiting for the ritual to be completed. Old Man Covenant began to suspect, but he never saved his children. They murdered him first. After reconnecting with Jeremiah and getting a very incomplete version of the recent troubles, you soon come across a hallway with an enormous family portrait. If you use Scry, a spell that shows hidden images and figures, the family's monstrous forms all reveal themselves. You'll slay every one of them as the game goes on, and even poor Jeremiah, beheaded with an expression of dull shock on his face, will have his moment of monstrosity. It's this kind of touch that makes Undying such a phenomenal horror title. It's very thoughtful about how the interactivity intensifies and alters the horror experience. Scry is a wonderfully designed spell. It's partly useful as a flashlight, banishing the excessive darkness from rooms and letting you find the damn door, but mostly, it's just useful for spooking yourself out. When you hear faint whispers, it means that Scry will reveal something nearby. Sometimes it's a psychic impression of monks who lived in the crumbling monastery nearby hundreds of years ago. Sometimes it's a grisly scene of death and dismemberment remembered through magic, and sometimes it's the true face of a vague and indistinct enemy. That's in addition to the many portraits and paintings that have more honest and awful magic versions of themselves, waiting to be flipped over with Scry. You can walk past all of them if that's what you want, but the way the spell suddenly makes these terrible images pop in with a whooshing noise is always unsettling, even deep into the game. Journal entries, extremely long and very well written ones, are everywhere. You'll eventually visit the private quarters of all of the game's many villains. You'll get a real idea of who the Covenant family are, as people and monsters both, in a way that's every bit as vivid as Barker's own short fiction. All of this unfolds at a different pace and as a different emotional experience than a piece of written fiction would, though. And of course, there's the estate. In literature, Gothic horror is always referred to as Gothic romance because it was, in many ways, the darker flip side of Romanticism. It was a huge fad among rich folks in the 18th century to build fake ruins on their estates, to incorporate a feeling of personal connection to the distant past into their personal landscapes. The romantic approach to ruins is one where their mysteries inspire the present, where there is a sense that what we do now will linger on in a similar way, a legacy that stoically moulders the years and proclaims that lives were well lived. The Gothic flip side says that living amongst decay decays the self, that these ghosts of the past reach into the future and destroy what they touch, where ruin is a sign that no progress has been made at all, a sign that things are stuck, that people are stuck. Stagnation is a sickness of the soul in the Gothic imagination, and the kind of people who would willingly live in these drafty haunted castles are damning themselves by doing so. "Oh, no one spends a night in the old Johnson place and lives," a cliché might go, and the Gothic moral there is that most people don't try to spend a night in the Johnson place and live very happily. If you spend a night in the haunted house, what happens to you is your responsibility. You should have known that the past would reach right out and grab you. The haunted castle, haunted estate, haunted house has always been the second most important character in the Gothic tradition, after the protagonist. In a way, this makes the level designers as important to telling the story as Clive Barker himself. Undying is actually pretty unique among shooters for how closely aligned the level design and thematic intent are. They genuinely did create a huge Irish estate spanning across fields and islands. Not only do you have a manor house that spans a dozen or more individual maps, some of them taking a half hour or more to explore, you have a monastery which you can visit in both the past and the present, a crypt, a lighthouse, a smuggler's cave, a remote cabin, an island of standing stones, under which lays the source of all the trouble. This sprawling complexity of design is the game's greatest strength and weakness combined. On the one hand, the estate is huge enough to really convey a sense of building dread. It just gets bigger and bigger as you get deeper and deeper. It gets more and more dangerous. When you return to wings of the house you've explored before, new surprises await. It's not open world. The design is linear. You have a defined section of the greater whole to explore at any given time. Both too far ahead and too far back are cut off by locked doors. But this does increase the sense of mystery. A locked door the first time through becomes a new route the second time around. A key you think you'll need in the second hour of the game doesn't actually turn up and become relevant until the ninth. And everywhere are hidden passages, optional rooms, illusions, traps. All of these design elements resonate with remarkable strength with the Gothic aesthetic. They completely succeed in modernizing the presentation of centuries-old scares. Even in movies, many of these haunted house cliches would have felt stale. Undying makes them feel vibrant again on the strength of how tied these scares are to player exploration and interaction. Scares and ambushes happen very inconsistently, keeping the player off balance and expecting anything, and the game only gives the vaguest idea of where you're supposed to go next. Unlike a modern game, Undying has no mechanic for preventing you from becoming lost or forgetting what you were supposed to be doing. Often, clues for progression are hidden inside the pages-long journal entries you collect. It's entirely possible to backtrack for 20 minutes at a time looking for something you missed. As far as horror goes, this is a major strength. It makes the place feel real. There are no magic arrows to direct you, no maps except the one in your head, and you can progress through the space however you like. There is sometimes more than one route from wing to wing, and failing to explore both routes will often leave you missing out on plot and in items. Having all this space that isn't actually necessary or relevant to your progression at a given moment is what sells the Gothic horror, what makes it concrete. You are often truly lost, which is where the weakness comes into play. Since this is a 2001 game, it had to battle with some major technical limitations, the biggest of which is limited map size. This huge area isn't experienced seamlessly. There are dozens and dozens of loading screens, and sometimes you have to backtrack through 4 or more map transitions. If it truly was a single structure, that would be one thing, but it's instead many smaller places sewn together into an architectural quilt. Remembering how to get from place to place is a lot of remembering where these seams are, and the patchwork experience of the Covenant Estate amplifies the confusion of navigating it by a good margin, and not in a way that's connected to the horror. Vague direction in the objectives coupled with this broken-up world can be infuriating, especially at the monastery. No one tells you that you need to go 3 maps deep to retrieve dynamite so you can go back to the first map and blow open an out-of-the-way pile of rubble. You just gotta figure that out for yourself, which can take a really long time. Long enough where the rising frustration with basic progression can overwhelm and defang the thick tension that the game works so hard to create. At least with books, you never have to say, well, I never reached the next chapter because I couldn't find it after a couple hours looking for it. The other limitation they had to overcome was texture quality and depth of detail. Undying's very much a game from 2001. It doesn't have much more actual detail in the interior or exterior environments than Quake 2 does. Especially outdoors, where all you get is a vague impression of larger space as you move through the navigable corridors, outdoor doors really, of grass and dirt. So it covers up these deficiencies with darkness, like flat out, I cannot see shit in here darkness. It's not uncommon to be unable to distinguish a door from the wall without using a spell or weapon to light the way. People made a lot of fun of Doom 3 for using the same trick, but Doom 3 did it to showcase its technical systems of light shadow much more than simply hiding muddy details. When you do use spells, what you see looks plain and washed out, which is not to say that this is an ugly game, it's just a product of its time. When the darkness isn't further inhibiting navigation, it can be very effective. The excellent sound direction, with howls and whispers and faint rustling breezes, directs the imagination to populate the darkness with monsters of its own. When the game's proper monsters do show up, you're braced for them. It's notable that Barker switched the protagonist out from someone who's pure pulp action to someone more grounded without removing the action itself. Patrick Galloway wields a gun in one hand and he wields magic in the other. He's not defenseless. Each monster has a different sort of weakness, and most require a certain type of a spell and weapon combination to defend against attacks and breach defenses most effectively. It's tactically a very, very smart shooter, and the amount of tactical options that are valid in a given encounter gets pretty hefty by the game's end. The spells themselves are a lot of fun, too. Honestly, it wouldn't be until BioShock, until this rhythm of two-fisted bullets and magic would really come into vogue, but if you enjoyed BioShock, Undying does an equally sharp job. Ammunition is scarce, and powerful ammunition, like silver bullets for the revolver and phosphorus shells for the double-barrel shotgun, are usually hidden in the obscure and optional corners of the map. This doesn't contradict the traditional elements of Gothic horror in any meaningful way. There's no Gothic tradition that says you have to be defenseless, just one that says you have to be vulnerable. And vulnerable you are. This game will kill you so quickly. And another move that's ahead of its time, Undying has unique death animations for the player depending on what it is that killed them. It's in these things that you can feel Barker's aesthetic at work. From the twisted fleshiness of the creatures to the violent ends you meet at their claws and tentacles, it feels right on the nose for the kind of body horror that Barker's made his name by. And as traditional a piece of horror media as Undying fundamentally is, Barker couldn't let it rest without bolting on one more of his authorial obsessions on top. I like Hellraiser 2 better than 1 because the majority of it takes place inside the puzzle box, inside the M.C. Escher hellscape where the first movie's monsters actually live. While body horror and sexual horror are Barker's most recognizable tropes, he's also got a serious thing about hellscapes and hidden realities. In his most epic and least discussed work, The Great and Secret Show, there's a realm called Quiddity. We go there 3 times as a soul, when we're born, when we fall in love properly, and when we die, for permanent. It's a dark and nearly infinite ocean with an island in the center. On one side of the ocean, the human world. On the other, a world of indescribable evil and pain. From time to time, visitors cross from one realm to the other. Even in his young adult series, the Aberrat novels, everything kicks off with a lighthouse that brings in the Sea of Isabella from a parallel world and allows the protagonist to cross over. In Undying, we have Oniros, a fugue plane where crumbling ruins, weirder and older than the Covenant estate, hang in the air and bird-like monsters rule in primitive tribes. Oniros is not a necessary addition to the world and lore of Undying, but it wouldn't really be Clive Barker's Undying without it. Your introduction to Oniros is beautiful. You reach out to open a door and it flies backwards off the frame, spinning out into a reddish void of a completely different world. A world that you happen to access via the door directly after the master bathroom. You end up spending a very lengthy period, about 2/3 of the way through the game in it, after a brief tease in the first couple hours. Its puzzles and dangers feel wonderfully strange and exotic, a mixture of the same feeling of dilapidated grandeur you get from the Covenant estate, mixed with a hefty glob of visual surrealism. There are even some fantastic programming touches for a 2001 shooter, like cobblestones appearing under your feet as you walk into an empty void. If it was more connected to the central plot, it would have been even better, but this realm is currently under the thumb of Otto Kessinger, Galloway's rival. But their rivalry really only exists in backstory, and Kessinger's reason for being in the plot at all is tenuous at best. Oniros is an act of authorial self-indulgence, but it's also a very memorable and remarkable diversion. And when you arrive back in the real world, it's time to crack open the final secrets of the Manor House. Unfortunately, Barker wasn't content to stop at one alternate reality. Undying includes 2, and the second one really sucks. Eternal Autumn is a jungle realm where tribal drums play in the background and you fight half-naked cavemen with spear guns. I'm serious, that's the deal. The idea is that this is what Bethany, the eldest sister, cares about as a magician in her own right, the forgotten gods and powers of places beyond European horror, and for just a map or two, this would have been passable. But this silly bullshit is the climax of the game, the last set of a dozen maps, a couple hours worth of outdoors and drum beats. Leaving out the fact that this is rooted in a kind of colonial fear of native cultures, a theme you see prominently in Lovecraft, it comes completely out of nowhere. Bethany's occult obsession with this kind of primitive magic is only touched on in passing in journal entries. The level design itself is awful, with no connection to the gothic themes of the rest of the game, and no mechanical connection to the very tactical situation of the previous map. It's just a couple hours of spear sniping in a world that looks like Turok with the gamma turned down to 0. And once you've beheaded Bethany, you're launched directly into the climactic betrayal and boss fight. No chance to get your bearings back in a world that the game had spent so long immersing you in, successfully. The boss itself is kind of vague, and it's uncertain exactly what it is, whether it's an ancient king you saw buried alive in a cutscene, or something new altogether. All that is clear is that defeating it is a total pain in the ass, not in a tense or exciting way, just in an I'm getting close to 0 feedback about which attacks are working and which aren't kind of way. And the cliffhanger ending. The evil at the Covenant Estate was just one eruption of paranormal violence. There are other places where the barriers between worlds are weak, and Patrick Galloway is being tapped by an order of monk warriors to defend them. After all that was done to steer the game away from the cliches of action video game writing and into the cliches of gothic fiction, the game ends up right at the tonal position it was in before Barker came into the picture at all. This isn't a fitting end for Galloway. It's a fitting end for Magnus Wolfram. Typically, if there's one thing that I do actually really trust Barker with, it's being unafraid to let his characters meet gruesome and definitive ends. Undying trails off and ends on a flat note, especially when you add in the slog of Eternal Autumn. Undying never got a sequel anyway, making the ending even flatter. Instead, Barker would work on a project that would reject almost everything about Undying's design, thematically, mechanically, and narratively. It would be called Jericho. Jericho's actually got more to it that's distinctly in Clive Barker's creative wheelhouse than Undying does, while simultaneously being a worse video game experience on every metric except sound and monster design. In an illuminating 2007 Gamma Sutra interview with Barker about Jericho, he said a couple key things. First, on the formation of the idea, quote, "It was going to be a novel. I have all these ideas buzzing around in my head, and I have to decide at some point with all the ideas where it belongs. Is this a book, a comic book, a novel?" And Jericho seemed to scream out, "Game." And that excited me, because I came into Undying when the material was well developed, and I didn't have a real chance to make so much of a mark on it. But then he went on to talk about the execution of the idea. Quote, "It would make a fucking terrible novel. It really would. It doesn't work. It screams out to be something other. Maybe if games hadn't existed, I would have made it a movie, but I much prefer the idea of having 20 hours to play this world, to enter this labyrinth, than the 2 hours or the way movies are going now. I like big novels. I really do. There's a payoff with a big novel when you get to page 900, where you feel like you've really had an experience. I think the same thing with games. You feel like you've journeyed. At best, games can be worlds of dreams that come back, and we have some measure of control over them. I think that's magical." End quote. What's curious to me about this interview is how he backpedals a bit from the 2001 interview I quoted earlier about how deep a mark he left on Undying, while talking up just how explicit and specific a representation of his ideas the game would be. He wanted a three-game deal originally. The following 2 games were canned when Jericho was found to be, to put it mildly, an underwhelming game. The less polite consensus is that Jericho is one of the worst big-budget shooters ever released, one which Mercury Stream, the developer, is just recently recovering from fully in terms of reputation after having produced several much better games in the following years. So, what happened? How is it that Clive Barker was so visibly proud of something that everyone else was pretty sure sucked like a Hoover vacuum? Fundamentally, it comes down to this. Barker didn't seem to fully understand that he only did really half the heavy lifting on Undying's horror. It was the level designers who took Barker's vision and made it a memorable and engaging reality. And it would be the level designers here in this game that would make the difference between success and miserable, crushing failure. It's not all on them, though. Barker should have trusted his gut. Jericho would have made a fucking terrible novel any way you cut it, and that doesn't actually change too much when you switch mediums. Barker's come close to writing the story a few times now, though, it feels like. Jericho's rooted in his personal aesthetic as much as Hellraiser is. It's evident in the script and the look of the monsters. The setup's even an echo of a short story he wrote for The Inhuman Condition, the 4th of his Books of Blood collection. The story is the shortest in all the Books of Blood, and it's called Down, Satan. In it, a billionaire wants to meet God. Having gotten no reply, he decides to get an audience with Satan, so he builds a terrible palace in the middle of the desert, a genuine hell on earth, with mile after mile of twisting corridors, torture chambers, and when anyone shows up to visit, they're never seen again. For years, until international law enforcement intervenes, the billionaire waits for Satan, invites him to show up by systematically and encyclopedically going through every possible evil act. But Satan never shows up. The rich man decides, though, that he had enough fun, that it didn't matter that he never got to meet Satan. Jericho is more explicitly paranormal than that, but thematically the same. We are our own devils, and we deform ourselves through our own indulgences. Here, there's two supernatural threads to follow. The main one is the mythic plot, which says that before the world we know it, God created a creature called the Firstborn. It was so powerful and corrupt that it was sealed away from the mortal world in the Pyxis, or the box. The blood of innocence, if it flows in rivers, can open the box, and throughout human history attempts have been made to breach it. Always the goal is power. Always the answer is a team of 7 witches and warlocks who seal the box shut again, with them still inside it. This is the second thread. It's the modern day, maybe a little in the future, and the Office of Occult Warfare is sending in Jericho Squad to seal the breach and defeat the Firstborn. As a high-level concept, this isn't too bad. The specifics could not have turned out campier if he tried, and I sometimes wonder if he did try to make the squad as ridiculous as possible. It's hard to say. The game seems to treat its internal fiction seriously. It seems to expect you to care about the characters and the stakes, but unlike Undying, where making the characters feel grounded and relatable was a priority for Barker, Jericho seems to revel in obnoxious surface cliches. The biggest problem is the common video game writing trope of letting characters be defined by the equipment they carry. Delgado carries the chain gun, so he's a loudmouth hothead with a fire demon pet. Church wields a katana, so she gets to be a cool and confident Asian woman. Cole is somewhere on the autism spectrum, so she has more high-tech abilities than other characters, and does the Lieutenant Uhura thing of reading computer data out loud. Dual-wielding pistols is kind of a cowboy thing, right? So give them to Rawlings, the grizzled mustachioed priest. Sniping is a decent cold act, so better make Black, the sniper, be mean and rude to everybody. Jones carries the assault rifle and the shotgun, which are the same gun in this game, and his personality is equally basic and default. The squad is led by Ross, whose shoes player 1 is in, but Ross dies within the first hour of the game. Comes back as a pretty unique mechanical device, though, so it's a temporary setback at best. Rather than have a single protagonist with a massive arsenal of spells and guns like Undying had, Jericho takes a page out of modern gaming's design handbook and limits you to 2 physical attacks and 2 spells. Then it immediately backtracks on that decision by letting you, as Ross's ghost, psychically possess any squad member you feel like and using their particular sets of skills and attacks. So all guns are available from the beginning of the game to the end, although spells are unlocked over time. It's a really peculiar way to go about it, and it makes the tactical experience of this game as fragmented as the navigational experience in the last one. Frequently, your progression will be blocked by an obstacle only one group member can be used to bypass, as in an object that is only interactive for their character and not just a combat encounter tailored to that character, without telling you that you need it to do so. So you'll hit dead ends where you'll shuffle through all 7 until you find out which one is arbitrarily qualified to lift a fence or collapse a blocked door. The idea is to give the player as many tactical options to the combat as they can stand, and in a shooter that wasn't explicitly one single long hallway from start to finish, I might be able to appreciate that. But Jericho is linear in a way that I've never seen before or since. There is no consistent location like in Undying. You begin in a corridor, and you keep moving forward through a single continuous hallway that occasionally leaps backwards in time until you hit the center of the Tootsie Pop and kill the Firstborn. There are no optional areas. There is nothing to collect. Ammunition is replenished by magic at checkpoints. Enemies spawn arbitrarily until they're done, and then whatever was blocking your way falls down. Very, very rarely there is a puzzle, and when it happens they are comically awkward to complete. But always forward, always along a single, hopelessly linear path. Even outdoors you rarely have a wide open space, and again there is no mechanical incentive to exploration, nothing hidden. Through this point to A to B odyssey, you're constantly trailing the other members of Jericho Squad behind you, following erratically like a herd of heavily armed cats. They need to be handy at any given time. You can jump quickly into whatever squad member you're looking at without going through the menus and having to think about who's who, while exploding enemies slowly amble up and take out big chunks of your squad at a time. In fact, the exploding enemies add a whole level of frustration to what would otherwise just be bad pathing. Your squad never aims for the bulbous weak points, and they never fan out, so these heaps of dynamite flesh just walk right up and kill everyone the minute you're firing in the wrong direction. Later on in the game, you run into wave after wave of these fellas, so yes, it's a squad shooter, but it is a squad shooter designed to make Player 1 do all of the heavy lifting. The other 5 members you're not controlling are little more than an entourage of spare parts. I genuinely wish there was an ounce of likability among the cast, because the situation they're in is fascinating and dire in a really classically Barker way. Once the breach is sealed, the Pyxis pulls in a chunk of the human world with it, preserved eternally with no age, decay, or death. Permanent death, anyway. The conflicts that open the breach become preserved and infinite, deepening hells that get more twisted the further back in time you go, the longer a group of souls have been trapped in the Pyxis. A cool visual metaphor actually used in the game is Russian nesting dolls, layers on layers of figurines compressed into the same space. The problem with this idea is how long it takes to actually get around to feeling the horror of it. The first slice, a contemporary one, is just sand and ruins. The second is World War II. Although the horror elements are pretty heavy and the Nazis are weird and deformed, you're still fighting Nazis in a dull corridor shooter, something most people playing have done approximately 9 billion times before. A bit of the uniquely Barker feel is still there, though, mostly with the boss. Her name is Lichthammer, and if it wasn't for the dialogue, her gender would be completely indeterminate. She's nothing but blood and scars, not wholly inhuman yet, but she's only been in the Pyxis for a half-century or so. There'll be time. It's your first real taste of the kind of madness that's further in, a Hellraiser 2 kind of madness. Like the puzzle box, there's no true death, which means no end to torment and suffering should you happen to be enduring some. The kind of scars Lichthammer bears, most of them her own doing, should be fatal, but instead they just accumulate, distorting and twisting both soul and body. This happens to everyone who stays in the Pyxis long enough. This is the face of endless war, hatred and cruelty so powerful it erupts through your skin. It's horror that comes through in the scripted moments, but gets totally lost in the long corridors of bunkers and corpses. Video games are already like a surreal hallucinatory version of World War II, making that the explicit artistic mandate adds less than you'd think to the aesthetic. The next time slice goes back to the Crusades, and also suffers considerably from muddy, immemorable visuals and an irritatingly simple, straightforward level design. It has a religious figure leading a children's crusade, whose innocent blood opened the breach hundreds of years ago. The children are pretty frightening, though, flying as ghostly apparitions before snapping into reality in a pop of blood, suddenly all teeth and tentacles. The boss is not frightening. He's just sort of an idea. The godly man who betrays God, and he leaves little impression. By the time you've beaten him, you're halfway through the game. If you've gotten here, you've probably been just coasting through on the fading hope that something, anything, genuinely interesting will occur. It won't. But the ideas already in play actually start to have some horrific weight to them as the squad shoots their way back into the ancient Roman era. One of the first things you see is a crucified man, but they've been in there for over 2,000 years, so whenever the crucified man started to droop, they nailed him back up again. Now his flesh hangs in sheets, nailed across the whole top of the board. He and the cross are one object now. When you finally get to an enemy, the centurion, he turns his shield toward you. And what's striking is not the flesh that binds the shield, it's the brightness of the paint underneath. Nothing ages in the Pyxis. The equipment they brought in is the same. If this Jericho squad becomes trapped in the Pyxis, all of their guns will work just the same until time ends. But the mind and the flesh will melt, eventually, running in tiny rivulets down the cold steel. These things trapped in here might well be your squad. They were certainly like your squad long ago. Now look at them. Now look at the bathhouse, the villa, a whole Roman town stuck in a 2,000-year loop, with nothing to do and nowhere to go. Ruling over the slice is the Vicus, a man of considerable appetite. He's impossibly fat. He looks like he's eaten enough to rupture over and over, sewing himself back up as he goes. Of course, there's no real food in hell, besides the people trapped there with you, so what's been going on for 2 millennia is an absolutely disgusting orgy of excess made possible only by using each other for meals, sport, and prey. It's a genuinely repulsive and fascinating vision. Suppose, after an orgy, no one gets to go home. Ever. Unendingly. There's a Chuck Palahniuk book called Haunted, which is framed as a writer's retreat where everyone stays in what's essentially a bunker for 3 months. They all agree that suffering makes for more interesting stories, and so begin to torment and murder one another. The deeper levels of the Pyxis are, at their best moments, a reflection of what that writer's retreat might look like indefinitely later. One of the most famous quotes from Jean-Paul Sartre is, "Hell is other people," but most people don't actually realize that the play this comes from means that, kind of literally, no exit. The play sees three characters in a mysteriously locked room. Over the course of the play, they realize that they're dead and will have to spend eternity with one another. Considering how they treated one another in life, this is hell indeed. Where Undying was a game that explored gothic tropes and traditional horror, this kind of existential and visual horror being used in Jericho is really contemporary. It's a modern hell, and while God is involved as far as the plot is concerned, he doesn't really need to be in order for the horror to function. The world of Jericho is hell. It's a prison. But when you fight in the Vicus' Colosseum, he is quite offended when you see it as such. Can't you see that this place, with no death and no consequences for any act of selfishness or cruelty, is closer to paradise than anything? This part of Jericho, the big idea part, the part that fires your imagination and lets you see beyond the live-fire hallway you actually get to experience, is a Clive Barker classic. All his favorite themes are in play, the things he uses to evoke curiosity and revulsion in equal measure, and they make the game something quite unlike any other horror shooter. It is a Clive Barker game, no doubt, but that doesn't and can't stop it from being a truly awkward and poorly realized shooter. Never will you move beyond the single corridor. Never will you have anything resembling serious tension in the action or the mechanics. You either do fine, or you get distracted and let your squad get blown up by the guys with the buboes. Towards the end, you start getting thrown into boss fights with much greater regularity, and it is very welcome. Take the gladiators of the Roman era, for example. You have to fire at a seam in their back so it slowly opens up, and once it does, you can break their spines and kill them. But then again, the fight against the Vicus is maybe one of the stupidest I've ever seen. The big guy's up on chains hanging from the ceiling, and he's only vulnerable when he opens up his guts to spew stomach acid at you petulantly. The final slice, during the Sumerian Empire's reign a few millennia back, is actually just one boss fight after another. You must defeat the original Jericho squad, who have all lost their minds and souls as time bleeds out toward the future. They're a visually striking level set, and it feels good to get to the point of the area so quickly. The Crusades and World War II slices meandered so badly that it was hard to keep track of why you were doing what you were doing, besides that going forward is good. Samaria is different. All these many squad abilities and weapons make sense against enormously tough enemies with very specific weaknesses, in fights that are more puzzles than endurance contests, where switching characters is strategic and useful. The way the rhythm of combat works for 90% of the game, a hallway full of cool-looking, dumb-acting bullet sponges does absolutely nothing to build horror, tension, or even justify the mechanical presence of your entourage of leather-clad battle priests. Samaria's almost total dedication to a series of unique and interesting boss fights is like a glimpse into a totally different version of Jericho, a much more compelling one, but it only lasts for about an hour right at the very end. I want to say that Jericho is a wholly vapid and empty game, but it isn't. Here and there, like the red and ragged scars that run across the skin of the game's monsters, genuine horror does come through. That undercurrent of horror is blanketed in such uninspired and haphazard mechanical design that the most frightening prospect is that you might actually die of boredom before you even get to the Sumerian slice. The ending of Jericho was famously bad at the time. It's a cliffhanger for the next two games that would never arrive, for one. For another, I can't actually come up with a way to make it less idiotic, either from a mechanical or narrative perspective. So, there's one ancient Sumerian priest left with his mind intact, Antidunuru. He's going to seal the breach and trap your squad inside. Antidunuru promises that this was your purpose, that your sacrifice will be remembered, and that you will fall into a dreamless slumber. Delgado points out quite rightly that nobody else has been doing any sleeping, and Antidunuru is trying to pull one over on the squad. All the previous squads had done the ritual, and look what happened. Which is a fair point. Here's where it goes wrong. Delgado. He's such a bad character, so irredeemably cliché, that when Antidunuru says that disrupting the ritual will destroy everything he ever loved, Delgado says, "Everything I ever loved is right here," referring to his pistol, which he shoots the priest in the head with. He then goes after the firstborn to, quote, kick its ass. Where's the Barker who once asked in the writer's room which one of them actually knew a count? Where's the Barker who humanizes his most ugly creation? Where's the Barker who knew better? I know he exists because I've read his books. I just can't account for Jericho. Unlike Undying, where Barker brought a literary touch to the writing and the design of the world to create something really strong, here he seems to be using the medium of video games to justify being lazy and ham-fisted and cheesy with a horror. Barker will insist that Jericho is art, and visually that can be true, but there have been get-well-soon cards written by Barker with greater depth of narrative and character than Jericho. The boss fight against the Firstborn is mechanically just as straightforward and dumb as Delgado's big moment. The Firstborn is a big baby. Like, actually, he is a big, mystical baby, and when he uses a spell on your squad, you have to use the spell back on him. Then you'll win. The Sumerian priests were much more interesting and intelligent boss fights. This is almost like a "have you paid attention to our mechanics? Yes or no?" pop quiz, an exit survey to see if you actually played as the whole squad, or if you just picked Jones and pew-pewed your way through. You don't even kill the Firstborn. Arnold Leach, a secondary villain, who looks amazing but has no real purpose in the story, flies out the cave exit with him in an explosion of light. What happens? Tune in next game. Then the squad swims down a hole and emerges in an infinite orange-lit ocean. Credits roll. No explanation. Barker assumed he'd be able to explain things later on in the sequels. He did not count on the game flopping as hard as it did. After all, how could something with so much of his imagination be dull? The problem is that it's all leftover scraps on the floor of his imagination. It's a cheap hot dog of notions and images and ideas that Barker really likes, but are tied together with the thinnest strands. If you're a big fan, if you've read hundreds of pages of Barker's alternate realities and mystical oceans, you see how it all slots together with his overall aesthetic. But if you don't, how could this ending be anything more than a final tremendous disappointment to cap off a game with little else besides disappointment? Barker was one of the first to showcase games as art, one of the first to really champion and cheerlead them as such. But he's also one of the first to show how wildly different the challenges of video games as a medium are from print and film. Thanks for watching. I want to take a moment to thank by name all the people who are currently donating $10 a month or more on Patreon. Usually I write everyone's name down and read them off a piece of paper or something, but at the moment I'm in a hotel, I'm on vacation with my girlfriend, and I don't have any paper, and I don't have any pens, and I've just got my laptop. So, still want to thank everybody, and here we go, starting with Cassie, Tom, Christian Zachariasen, Soyib Sheik, Will Hooten, Jake Mays, Dennis Clark, Kevin DeBolt, Jake Brennan, Akiko Mizunami, Alexander Leister, Brian Hill, Igor Babiuk, Cameron Vigian, Justin Hughes, Thunder O'Brien, Jared Meyer, Carlos Mauricio, and Duarte Pereira, Calypse, Devin Vernon, Balder Carlson, Carl Clark, Valtir Ingborson, Max Wellington, Jonathan Holder, Nick Cole Hamilton, Jay Naylor, Rick Storer, Charles Favreau, Kim Winson, Scott Miller, Carol Henderson, Bradley J. Fisher, Daniel Hartnett, Matthias Hellstrand, Zach C., Niles D. McDonald, Bill Dobbins, Tom Rauerdink, Zig Kuzniers, Jonas Martinson, Ivan Buccio, Will Wargrave, Jack Harvey, Jack Dawson, Michael Coonan, D. Stex, Robert Glover, Jacob Robertson, Eddie Burton, Andrew Schiffel, Kevin Schaub, Nathaniel Tenzar, Bob Belcher, Alexander Dimitriou, Sharif Kazemi, Ariel Badger Release, Trivium Art History, Rob Tackett, Martin Markov, Tim Moon, Divyath Faust, Colby Howard, John Walsh, Lee Jones, Alex Zalato, Daniel Morimiri, Stephen Prummel, Matthew, Devin Fitzpatrick, Joe Hewison, Sasha Ayar, Stephen Potiak, Angel-Headed Hipster, Simo Polakowski, Paul Cocker, Jody Warren, Colin, Matthew Zender, Dylan Sibley, Cameron Jackson, David Fry, Michael Atwell, Brad Carr, Cameron, Bradley Smith, Jeffrey Knutson, I Cannot Fly, Wesley M., Aaron Albuck, Alexander Heavens, Noah Duggins, Martin Karsten, Brett Galmo, Andreas Larson, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Ivan Marinov, Chris Larkey, Aiden AK-47, Rob Clark, Harley McAvoy, Carl Gleason, Tim Marsh, Joshua VV, Tyzer Vicarian, Preston Allen, Kimmo Heikkinen, White Zero, Yuri Petnis, Comfy Hat, Ron Gervais, Dalton Seiler, Michael Benson, Nobody, Andrew Steele, Erica Mikkonen, Dirk Warbrul, Matthew Mason, Mage Flyer, Q-Ray X, N.K. Jemison, David Carlson, Evan Hill, Ashley Rain, Brian Plokelman, Chris Kaon, Pay, Camel, Brandon Boat, Josh, David Gilbreth, Galak, Morton Sconning, Josh Farkas, Dewey, Niels Bachfrommer, Spyro Sedaris, Connor Biblo, Ryan Gutst, Amir Aguilar, and Sam Gustin. Thanks again to you and everyone else who donates to me on Patreon. It's you guys who make these videos possible. Thanks for everything, and for this month, happy Halloween. They are transgressive enough to resonate with Barker's own modern aesthetic, as foul and transfixing in Barker's original work as they are in much dustier tomes. The clichés that Barker wanted to avoid in the script weren't the ones that were 200 years old. He'd play around with those. What he removed from the script is the kind of over-the-top late 90s action game nonsense that was so pervasive in that era of FPS titles. Undying's original protagonist was a major product of his time, and as such was the first on the chopping block. Here's Barker from a 2001 interview about the game. Quote, "We had a really charmless hero. We had this fellow called Magnus, Count Magnus Wolfram, who was bald, tattooed, looked like a comic book hero, and I got them all in a room, and I said, look, does anybody in this room know a Count? No. Does anybody in this room know anybody called Magnus? No. Does anybody really want to be in this guy's skin? Since this is first-person play, why would you want to be in this man's skin? Why would you play as him? And so we threw him out, and I said, look, you've got a gay man in charge here. Bring me somebody I want to sleep with. Bring me somebody fabulously sexy. And because my training is in art, I drew some sketches. They were mainly of what I wanted his face to be. And this brilliant artist, Brian Horton, about 10 days later, sent me the character that now appears on screen." End quote. The many clichés of Gothic horror are malleable. They can be made unsettling and impactful with artistically genuine perspective behind them. But the many clichés of first-person shooter writing circa 2001? All that shit's gotta go. So with Patrick Galloway on the drawing board and Magnus Wolfram in the wastebasket, Barker's reimagining of the game began.
I found a school with a... I joined a special unit.
Barker would go on to say in the interview that he felt like he had a hand in shaping all the characters, and it does feel like it. He even voices Ambrose, the eldest brother, in the second boss fight of the game. I have no idea what Magnus Wolfram's connection to the story might have been, but Patrick Galloway starts off many years before the game even opens. During World War I, he served with a guy named Jeremiah Covenant, a bookish officer who helped him through the war. During the conflict, they encounter an occult group whose leader carries the Gelzabar Stone, a funny little magic trinket. Galloway takes it with him, and having started down the path of paranormal detective, he continued that direction after the war. He can't return to Ireland. He was framed for the murder of his wife by another occultist named Kessinger, but Jeremiah sends him a letter asking him to come right away, and Galloway's not one to let down a friend. So, the game opens. Galloway walking up to the gates of the mysterious and foreboding Covenant estate. This is about as classic as you get for the Gothic setup. I wonder if the reason Barker went in such a traditional direction with horror has to do with the newness of the medium. Barker, in his own written work, has an extremely contemporary aesthetic. He's unpredictable in setting, characters, and execution. In one short story, a quarreling gay couple's vacation is interrupted by two towns that form themselves into giants, linking together like ants in a flood, and then battling, like they have for hundreds of years. In another, a scientist working on an aphrodisiac gets it much too right and spirals down into monstrous evil hedonism, and in other, the demons who run New York City.
The former is regarded as a great, albeit mostly forgotten game, and the second is a notorious flop, the Edsel of horror shooters. In terms of design, they're pretty much opposite games, yet Clive Barker worked on each, gave his creative stamp to both, and believed in their worth as art and horror media. Even Jericho. Barker's many successes in print and film are well known. His bold and strange stabs into the medium of video games are a lot less talked about, even less often talked about in context with the author's other works. What I want to know is straightforward, but the answer is complicated. Is there anything truly and uniquely Clive-Barkery about the Clive Barker games?
It seems fair to say that Clive Barker saved Undying. The game had been under production for a while before he was asked to come in and provide new direction by the publisher. What they handed him was something extremely traditional, a Gothic manor with a family curse, which is the oldest book in the tricks as far as horror goes. The specific setup, the Gothic romance, goes back to 1764 and Horace Walpole's novel The Castle of Otranto. A Gothic novel takes place in a dilapidated but palatial setting, usually a manor or a castle. It focuses on the ghosts of the past, both literal and psychological. Its primary theme, across novel after novel during the 18th and 19th century, is that the sins of the father will consume the sons. Depending on the author, this would be paired with a lot of really bizarre sexual horror, like in 1796's The Monk. That's the thing. As incredibly dated, cliché, and well-worn as the Gothic novel and Gothic tropes are,
Hi, I'm Noah Gervais. In this video I'm going to be talking about both of Clive Barker's games, Undying and Jericho. Undying is regarded as kind of an underappreciated classic, but Jericho is a notorious flop. Both of them have Clive Barker's stamp all over them. We're going to be talking about why and how they work both as games and Clive Barker's own private creative work. Let's get started. There was a time in the 80s when it looked like Clive Barker was going to become the #1 name in horror media, where his particular vision of the weird and fantastic was going to surpass even Stephen King's in recognizability. At the time, he was certainly one of the most bold and creative voices in the genre. Barker did a lot to take body horror and horrific sensuality mainstream. King's kind of horror is usually small-town characters using hidden depths to defeat strange evils and their personal failings, but Barker's work is more about those personal failings manifesting as the horrific creatures and powers themselves, selfish and hedonistic impulses taken farther than comfort or safety or sanity ought to allow. Many horror authors, directors, and game makers conceive of scaring the audience as the goal. Make them yelp, get their hearts racing. You stamp something Clive Barker's so-and-so, though, and the implication isn't that you'll get so straightforward a horror experience. Ideally, if a piece of media is true to Barker's aesthetic, its main goal is provoking deep discomfort and a kind of sympathetic revulsion. Hellraiser, Barker's most famous movie and visible creation, has monsters who all used to be human. They used to be terrible humans, which makes them excellent monsters. The puzzle box in that movie is a good example of a classic Barker trope. A hidden universe, secret but in plain sight, wherein extreme and endless sensation, infinite pain and infinite pleasure transforms its visitors permanently into chimeras of their foulest desires. They are trapped forever in hells within and without, deformed hells of the body, twisted hells of the mind. So, visually, you've got this aesthetic of otherworldly realms populated by angry, fleshy, demonic forms, and tonally, you've got this aesthetic of decadent madness, something more fundamentally sexual and psychological than authors like King or Kuntz, something more deranged and chaotic than Anne Rice, something as fantastic and surreal as Lovecraft without the infuriating vagueness. He was a really transformative voice in horror for a lot of years, and then he kinda drifted away. Barker's been continuing to do interesting work this whole time, but his star has waned, and his recognizability as a big-name horror guy is at a bit of a low. During the early and mid-2000s, Barker put in work on 2 video games bearing his name, 2001 survival horror FPS Undying, and 2007 squad shooter Jericho.